Right, good evening everybody, and thank you for joining us for this second webinar on Feeding the Ewe, hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Katie Thorley and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Manager for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on Feeding the Ewe Part 2. Our presenter this evening is Lesley Stubbings. Lesley is an independent consultant and is well known within the sheep sector, especially for nutrition work, and both Lesley and Kate helped with developing the updated Feeding the Ewe manual. The plan of action is Lesley will run through a presentation and then there'll be time for questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout, and if anyone would like to ask a question at any point, then please type it in the box on the right hand side of your screen and we will ask the questions at the end of the presentation. We have 200 people plus registered for tonight's webinar, and we'll hopefully keep everything working smoothly, better than what we managed last week, and we won't lose Lesley, but thank you to Elena, who's working behind the scenes to keep everything running smoothly. We'll hopefully obviously keep these to a minimum. So without further delay, I'll hand you over to Lesley for tonight's presentation on Feeding the Ewe.
Thank you, Katie. Good evening, everybody. And yeah, hopefully we won't have any hitches. I've got decent broadband, so we should be okay. Right, so part 2, Feeding the Ewe. We're going to pick up, I'll just recap very quickly where Kate would leave off, but just to run through what we're going to have in webinar 2. So I'm going to look at choosing supplements, what we can look for, how we can actually make sure we're getting the best ones and the best value for money. A little bit look about why body condition score is so important, and this will use some of the results from the AHDB KPI project. I'm then going to look at some troubleshooting, so some practical issues and possible solutions, and I'm sure that that will help then our final bit, which will be some discussion and questions. And we have had 2 or 3 questions in between the 2 webinars, and I'll try and cover those off as we go through, but clearly if they're not done to the question of satisfaction, we can come back to them. So let's just recap quickly on the main points, underlying points from what Kate was saying in her webinar last week. And the first one was that what we're really trying to do is to optimize the contribution from forage. And there are 2 reasons why that is very important. First and foremost, from the point of view of your pocket, is that it is by far and away the cheapest option. If we look at pence per megajoule of energy, the different sources we have there on the screen, then it's quite clear that feeding compounds is going to be 4 to 5 times more expensive per unit of energy than grazed grass. So that in itself is a really good reason. But then we've also got to consider actually the benefits to the ewe and the benefits to the way that her digestive system actually works as well. So what you covered off in the last webinar was a run through of rumen function, and what this really means for us is that the vast majority of even the energy, but certainly the protein, which I'll cover in a slide or 2, is derived from that rumen. So keeping that rumen healthy and productive at all stages is how we're actually going to ensure that the ewe stays healthy and performs as we want her to. So what we're trying to do is to provide that with a constant balanced nutrient supply to make the best of the diet on offer. We want to supply fermentable energy, so forage and digestible fibre, and if necessary, some concentrate. But the emphasis is always on how much can we get from the forage, and therefore what sweeties do we need to add on top in terms of the concentrates to be able to actually supply what the ewe needs. Whereas what we find in practice so often is that we get carried away with how much concentrate we're feeding, and the forage almost becomes a secondary thing that's there on the side if she wants to eat it. So then what we're looking for is a supply of rumen degradable protein. Oops, sorry, let me go back. We're looking at a supply of rumen degradable protein, and that is going to be the main source of protein for the ewe. For some reason, I am having a technical hitch, don't worry about it. We'll go back again. Oh. We'll get there in a minute. It's not going on as it should do. So we have a supply of rumen degradable protein that goes into the rumen. That is actually then how the ewe derives a lot of her protein. And my next slide really takes us through that and talks about how this protein supply works. Now, everyone's heard quite a lot in recent years about supplying undegradable protein to use, and in late pregnancy, that's how we should be supplying protein. But the reality of it is that the vast majority of the protein that the ewe is actually going to digest herself is from the rumen microbes. And they make this protein by taking fermentable energy and nitrogen from the protein sources that they degrade and basically growing. So the vast majority of the protein that the ewe uses is their dead bodies. They die, they pass out of the rumen down into the abomasum and the lower gut, and they are then digested. And that is her main protein supply. So ensuring that those microbes have got the right balance of energy and protein is really important if we're going to have a healthy rumen and we're going to make the best of forage. So on top of that, a small amount of protein escapes the microbes, and this is the little bit of undigestible, undegradable protein, and some people might refer to that as the quality protein in the diet, but this really is a very small amount. And to just give you an example, spring grass, if you were to put a ewe out to spring grass in late pregnancy, the later lambers, and there's enough grass in front, then there is plenty of protein in that spring grass. In fact, more than enough protein to satisfy her requirements in late pregnancy. There is no requirement for anything over and above that. So really important that we get that right. And so when we talk about metabolizable protein, the total amount of protein the ewe requires, then that is the sum of both of these. The big part will be rumen microbes, dead bodies that she's going to digest, and the other bit will be the little bit on top that's undegradable protein. So if we look at this table here, and we, for example, look at a ewe, 70 kilo ewe, so a mule type half-bred ewe, late pregnancy with twins, then what we say is she needs 126 grams a day of this metabolizable protein. And if we just use an example here of how we might calculate that, then we perhaps feed a good silage, a 10.5 ME, well-fermented type, either big bale or clamp, it doesn't matter, with perhaps something like 0.35 of a kilo of concentrate to go with that, and that's going to be a 21% compound. Then the rumen microbes, we calculate that through based on the energy and the degradable protein, and that's actually going to give us 85 grams of our total, just as microbial protein. We then have some undegradable protein in the silage and to add to it, so we've already got 113 grams simply from feeding the basic diet. And then if we just look at the extra little bit of DUP that we need from the compound, then we've got the job done. We've got 128 grams there because we need a little bit of DUP from the compound. And that's how we would calculate it. So just to really make the point that the DUP is that little bit at the end that we add just to make sure, but the vast majority of the protein she's going to use is going to come from those microbes. So that then leads us into how do we start thinking about the quality of compounds, and there are two or three things here really. One is that, as we kept saying, and Kate would say last week, we're trying to feed as little as we can of the right sort of compound, and there's actually, you know, the clue in the word concentrate. We're trying to concentrate what we need into the smallest possible amount. So the first thing we can do when we're looking at maybe buying a compound is what's available on the label. That's really important. And this is the basic stuff that's on the top of the label, has to be published by law. We have to know what the oil content is, and we would be looking for that to be 4 to 5%. We need to look at the ash content. Now, the ash is basically all the bits that will be left if you burn the whole thing, and that's totally indigestible. It contains some good stuff because it contains all the trace elements and the minerals, but also it contains undigestible stuff that would reduce the value of the feed to the animal. So we want that to be less than 10%. Fibre, similarly, there's good fibre, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but generally in a compound that's going to be 12.5 upwards ME, so in that bracket that's going to be high quality, we would want that to be less than 10%. The crude protein would be as required, and we'll look at that again in a minute. And then the other thing we've got is a list of ingredients. And you can tell an awful amount from that as to whether or not you've got quality ingredients in there, or whether or not the compound is going to be relatively low quality. So if we just look at typical ingredients that we would get in there, then things like wheat, wheat feed, that is very often in a sheep compound. It's quite high in protein, and actually it's not that low in energy, so wheat feed isn't necessarily a bad thing to be in there. It certainly is better than some of the ones lower down the list, such as palm kernel and sunflower. Wheat distillers, dark grains, we see quite a lot of that there. Good source of protein, good source of energy. Sugar beet pulp, again, more of an energy source, but a digestible fibre, so a good thing to have there. Barley and beans. Rapeseed meal, a source of protein, mainly for the rumen microbes. And then sunflower and palm kernel, okay in small amounts. And soya meal, of course, is going to come in as being a source of good balance of protein, quite a lot of quality, the undegradable, but also some degradable. Now, one of the tricks when you're looking at these ingredients list is to find where the molasses is in the list, because when you look at a label, these are in descending order. So the one that comes first is there in the highest proportion, and then it's in descending order as we go through. And when you find molasses, that's typically in a compound at somewhere around about 5 to 7%. So you can look at it, and anything that's above that, you can think, well, it's going to be more than 5 or 7%. Anything below that is going to be in relatively small amount. So for example, when you're looking for your soybean meal in a high quality compound, you would want to be looking at it to be above molasses in the list rather than below molasses in the list. So just looking at that, thinking about it, maybe going, if you're not sure of an ingredient, go online and have a look at what its protein profile and what its energy level is, and then you can make a much better decision on whether or not the compound is high quality or not. And certainly, you know, you can avoid things like, we don't see too much oat feed in compounds. Now, oat feed is very, very low quality. You're going to really reduce the compound quality if that's in there. And here what I've done is I've just done a couple of examples just to show how we can perhaps use that information to take a judgment on which product is going to be worth more money, and whether we can afford to pay more for the better quality one. So product 1 on the left, we've got an oil of 5, that's okay. Fiber's a bit higher than the 10 I said, and so is the ash, but it's an 18% protein. And product 2 on the right, similar, again an 18%, but here we've got a lower fibre, it's below 10, the ash is down at 7. And if we then look at the ingredient list, we can see that the one on the left has got wheat and wheat feed number 1, wheat feed and wheat number 1 and 2, then we're to rapeseed, and then we've got palm kernel, sunflower, oats feed, and remember, there's our molasses, there's our baseline, and then it's high pro and into limestone. By the same token, on the other side, we've got barley, wheat distillers, sugar beet, rapeseed, wheat feed. We've got high pro and wheat above molasses, and then a little bit of whole maize in there, which would just give an extra boost to the energy. So product 2 is going to be significantly higher in energy, and also the protein profile is going to be superior as well. So what's it worth? Well, I just took a flyer at this, and actually the differential in reality this year would be greater than this. But let's say product 1 is £195 a tonne and product 2 is £210 a tonne. I would say, based on the ingredients, that product 1 is probably going to just about scrape in at 11.5 ME, and that would make it cost-wise 1.93 pence per megajoule of energy. Product 2, however, would be a good 13 ME, and that would come in at 1.84 pence per megajoule of energy. So product 2, if we work it on a pro rata, either product 1 has to be worth £185 a tonne, because product 2 is worth at least £25 a tonne more. Plus we have the benefits of the additional protein quality, and also the fact that you're going to need to feed less of it, so you're going to be safer. It's much safer for the rumen to feed smaller amounts of compound. So I hope that just gives a little bit of an idea how you could maybe sit down and try to make some judgments and decisions on what compound quality, what they're worth, and choose the higher quality products. Generally speaking, they're always going to be the better value for money. One of the other things that we see used increasingly these days are licks, blocks, buckets. This now, compared to where we were even 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago, is a huge market. Now, there is a place for all of these things, and again, when we perhaps look a little bit further on, when I do a little bit of troubleshooting, one or two of the practical issues, some of these will come up. But it's important to remember that originally, and this goes back about 40 years now, originally blocks were designed to supplement hill ewes in harsh environments, and they were really just designed to be able to supply nitrogen to the rumen so that the rumen microbes could digest poor quality forages. So ewes on the hill, Molinia, heather, very low quality forages where nitrogen was limiting, and that's what they were designed to do. But of course, they're also something that you can use in a situation where perhaps practically you can't feed compound every day and you just want to be able to give you a little bit of a boost. So much more widely used these days to provide energy and protein and trace elements and minerals. But what you have got to watch is that these are very expensive ways of supplying energy and protein. And therefore, your question you have to ask, I think, in these situations is, could I feed compound? Do I really feel I can justify feeding something which is going to cost so much more? So if we have a 12 ME feed block, we're actually looking at spending 5 pence per megajoule of energy with a feed block, as opposed to a compound which is 240, 280 pounds a tonne, which is probably more what people are paying this year, would cost us less than half that amount. So it's more than double per unit of energy. And if that, practically speaking, is something which is worthwhile doing, then that's fine. But also remember that in terms of what the sheep are actually eating from blocks and buckets, it's very, very small contribution to their overall requirement. So you have to factor that in and decide whether it's something that you want to do. Okay, so let's have a little think about body condition scoring. We can come back to any of those points on compounds and supplements and so on at the end. If people want to start thinking of questions, then we can come back to those. Now, everybody's seen these body condition scores many, many times, I'm sure, and they are used as targets, and they've been shown to be really good targets over the years. But it's since the advent of EID and our ability to be able to actually measure body condition score and log it against individual ewes over time that we've been able to look at some of the longer term impacts of body condition, and also the impact of falling way outside of the ranges that you've just seen in that target table. So thinking about what we normally talk about with body condition, we look at the production cycle, and we know that certainly weaning to mating, we need to be thinking about getting ewes back into good condition. And then that has an impact on what happens at scanning. So we've then got mating to scanning, and again, there's an implication there for condition. We then go through from scanning to lambing, all the way around to lambing through to weaning. And that production cycle is all linked, and at all of those stages we've just seen in that table, we have target scores to actually try and meet. In terms of key times then for body condition scoring, these are the times when I think everyone would be used to at least trying to body condition score. So at least 8 weeks pre-tupping, scanning, pre-housing, 8 weeks pre-lambing, late pregnancy, 8 weeks post-lambing, and then again at weaning. But the question is, can we actually show the impact of either getting that right or getting that wrong at any of those stages? And if we get it wrong at any of those stages, how long does it take before that impact goes away? And so the KPI project has looked at that over 3 years, and that data is still being analysed. But what we can show you is that there are impacts, and they are quite long-term impacts. So just looking at this next graph, looks a bit scary to start with, but what we've got, I've just put one arrow up here. So if we just look at that row of blue blobs to start with, up the left-hand side we've got body condition score, and this is basically the profile of this particular flock when it went to the tup in 2013, ahead of the lambing in 2014. So what we can see from that is that the size of the blob is the number of ewes in that body condition. So the bigger the blob, the more ewes in the flock were in that condition. And we can see that in 2013, for a variety of reasons, one of them was a brush with a nasty worm, the Barber's pole worm, and various things were going on. That flock was actually really quite lean. So you can see a lot of ewes in body condition score 2 to 2.5. Very few of them actually making the 3.5 level at that stage. And there's also a big spread of ewes, so all the way down to body condition score 1. Needless to say, they didn't stay in the flock very long, all the way up to the odd one at 3.75 and 4. And then the following year, what we had was a massive effort. So if we can just look at the far side of the screen without me moving the mouse, just here, we can see that between weaning and tupping in that year, looking at the blue ones again, there was a massive effort to get those ewes back into the right body condition, ready for tupping, where the red arrow is now pointing in the autumn of 2014. So the question is, what impact did those body conditions have on the 8-week weight of lambs the following year? And the answer is quite a stark one. So if we look at the 8-week weights on that farm, in 2014, the average is 19.6. In 2015, it's 21.6. So 2 kilos difference, which is massive. And you can also see that using 20 kilos as our actual target that we were trying to reach, we went from 42% to 64% hitting the target. And possibly equally as important is the number of small lambs on the farm. Now these are lambs that are 85% or less of that target 20 kilos at 8 weeks. And what we know now is that if they fail to reach that 85% level and we follow them through, they are indeed the lambs that never do anything. They are permanently stunted. There's been an issue with their development in that early stage, and they're always going to be lambs that are prone to all sorts of things, and they're the runts that are left at the end of the year. So we saw a big reduction in those as well. So that's just one little snapshot. Obviously, there's a huge amount of data in that project. But those are those key things. The increase in body condition was absolutely critically part of that, and we've been able to replicate that sort of effect on the other farms and in other years. Now, some of you will notice that in 2016 things dropped back again, and that was because there was a problem with body condition. There's actually an issue managementally in terms of labour, and the body condition dropped again, and it had that impact again on the 8-week weights. So just looking at this again, that's where we were in the first year, that's where we were in the second year, and really the impact was almost entirely, we think, down to the fact that the ewes were in better body condition. And interestingly, if we don't get it right at that tupping stage, then there is still there's an impact at 8 weeks, even if you have it right by scanning. So it is an impact of the bit between weaning and tupping, rather than any stage beyond that in terms of putting the body condition score back on. So just to sort of highlight some of those things, in terms of body condition, we are saying now that these are long-term effects. It's not as simple as hitting short-term targets. We do need to be keeping them going year on year and not letting them slip below those targets at any stage. So keeping them within the ranges. Not only is it very hard to put body condition back on, but it's also very expensive. So if you get ewes down in body condition score less than 2, the energy cost, the dry matter cost is absolutely huge, and it is very difficult to do. The other thing is that when you're doing this and you know it's so important to reach that, then it drives decisions such as when you have to wean and selling store lambs. On that particular farm, when we had a lot of body condition score to put back on, and you look at what dry matter's in front of you and what the ewes need, it becomes actually not a decision at all as to whether or not you sell store lambs. You just have to if you're going to get those ewes back into condition. One of the other things that has come out of the project is that in the past we used to say it was okay for ewes to lose up to half a score in mid-pregnancy once they were settled in lamb past the implantation stage and up to scanning. And what the project has highlighted to us, and we need to do some more analysis, but in every case when we followed it through, it has actually shown the fact that those ewes which continue to gain just a little bit of weight and a little bit of condition all the way through from mating up to scanning are those ewes that perform better later on, particularly in terms of the 8-week weight of the lambs. So we are seriously challenging now whether or not that is sensible advice. And certainly I've changed my advice to my customers now that we do not want to be seeing ewes losing condition and weight in that mid-pregnancy period. Protein requirements, body condition, you hear a lot of talk about ewes needing more protein in late pregnancy because of the periparturient rise in worm egg output. When we did the literature research for the feeding the ewe and talking to experts who've been involved, it became obvious that actually the overriding factor here is body condition. So ewes in good condition, they're being fed well, their protein requirements are as prescribed in the standards. It's only those ewes that are struggling body condition wise that are potentially going to respond to higher protein. So from the point of view of efficiency and cost, much better to have the condition and then not have to feed the extra. And also in terms of late pregnancy feeding levels as well. All of these things can be driven by the fact that if body condition is right, then we can stick to the standards and work through it and not have to start adding extra bits and pieces in there. Okay, so body condition then we're now looking at as being a major KPI, so a major key performance indicator. If the body condition in the flock is within the target ranges, within half a score or a score of the range at all times, and all ewes in the flock fall within that range, that is an absolutely key performance indicator as to how well that flock's going to do in the subsequent 12 months and beyond. Okay, so one or two troubleshooting things then. Some of the more common issues that arise, because it's all very well, I can sit behind my desk and produce rations and recommendations for people, but at the end of the day we've still got to actually put these things into practice and feed the sheep rather than just let them read the book and hope they're going to do their best. So we have to really make sure that the diets are presented in a way that ensures optimum and even access and intake across the group. Now obviously you're looking at a picture there of ewes eating a TMR. They can't all eat together. But because the TMR is there 24/7 and they know that, then they can go little and often. And that really is the ideal way, if we could all feed sheep, the ideal way to feed them in late pregnancy. Clearly we can't all do that, but we do have to try and make sure that they're eating what they should be eating. So one of the really important things is that at all times in late pregnancy, we've got to try and monitor how much forage they're eating against predictions. So if Kate or I or another advisor gives you a ration recommendation, it should always have with it and a prediction as to how much forage we think they're going to eat on a daily basis, so that you can monitor it over a group, perhaps go and weigh your bales and just try and get a feel for whether you're within 5% or so of what we're predicting. Really, really important. And one of the reasons why that's really important, again, is that what we're trying to do, we saw this graph last week, is to minimise the amount of compound feed, because we know, as this graph demonstrates, every time we feed concentrate, we're going to drop rumen pH, and we're going to interfere with those microbes that digest fibre. And there's our TMR there, which keeps a very stable pH all the time. We're trying to get as near that as we possibly can. But if we don't actually keep an eye on how much forage is being eaten, and we're relying on it very heavily, then that's when the wheels might start to wobble a little bit. So, and I can all you hear groaning now, saying, "Oh well, you know, if only we could feed sheep like this." Well, yeah, okay, not very many people are going to be able to feed sheep like this, but I deliberately put this slide in because whilst we can't all do it like this with the TMR, what we can do is to aspire to get as close to it as possible. And that's what's always in my mind when I'm doing rations and recommendations for people, is that I'm trying to get that particular person as near to this situation as I possibly can. And it's really interesting, these ewes will eat way over and above the book value of dry matter intake all the way up to lambing, simply because their rumen is functioning so smoothly. And the nearer we get to this situation, the more smoothly and the better job the rumen will do for us. So on that basis then, you know, ideal situation, but we just have to be thinking about how we're actually presenting forages to use. Can they actually get in and eat as much as we think they're going to? Can we actually make sure that when we're giving you straw, for example, the old girl there with the straw on her head, rather than perhaps putting it in ring feeders where they're having to work really, really hard and pull it and waste a lot, her intake is going to be a lot less than the one that I've just put up there with the straw on her head, who's rootling around in her bedding and is probably going to be able to pick through, eat straw, which is almost as good as a bog standard hay, and bed herself down on the rest. Her intake is going to be much, much higher. So presenting forages is really important. And the sort of common problems that we see are quite clearly in this picture. There isn't enough space for them all to eat. One ring feeder in that pen is just not going to cut it. We really need to be offering at least 150 mil, 6 inches in old money of forage space for ewes to be able to eat, so they can come and go and make sure. And if you're not sure, get a tape measure and just run it round the outside and just see how much space there actually is and what you're expecting ewes to do in terms of intake. As we've said before, the forage isn't simply there as a bit of a top up so that, oh, well, she wants a bit of fibre, she can go and get it. It really does have to be the main part of the diet, with the concentrate simply being the top up. And another example there on the right hand side, you know, a bale of actually what looks like really quite nice hay being pulled at, trampled on, wasted, and very little actual access for quite a full pen of ewes. That is going to limit intake as well. So a couple of other things, and this is something I think which is quite important, and I always quite like if someone's got problems with feeding, and if you're not happy, perhaps you know you can't understand why you're still getting cases of twin lamb disease or prolapse or whatever it is. I think it's always worth walking back in the shed at lunchtime and just see what's happening. And at lunchtime you should see something a bit like this really. Ewes lying down, doing what they need to do, ruminating so that they can digest their feed properly. There's still feed outside the pen there with the TMR. They know they can get it when they want. But that's the sort of thing that I would like to see. If when you go into a shed and someone's trying to push a lot of concentrates in and the ewes are looking up and jumping around and looking for the next meal, then maybe there's a few issues. And on the right-hand side here, we've got probably a typical example of where it isn't working properly. Several things wrong with that. A, clearly there's not enough space. Maybe the food hasn't been put out regularly enough, or they've been without the use of wheelbarrowing, so their bums are higher than their front legs because the bedding's built up, and you can just start to see a few there with dirty backs where they've been jumping up and down all around each other. The diet on the left is exactly the same as the diet on the right, but the outcome of those two diets is going to be very, very different simply by the way that the food has actually been put in front of the sheep. So it is worth just, if you've got a few problems, just sort of standing back and having a think and a chew of the fat as to whether or not there are any logistical things that you can do. Our feeding concentrates is one of the areas maybe where we can do something. So, because it can, when you're in troughs, these guys here are obviously going to both sides of a trough and giving us a nice long line, which was quite a nice shot, but that can be difficult to achieve in practice. Now, the book says that we should be allowing 450 mil, 18 inches in old money, trough space per ewe in late pregnancy. That actually can be quite difficult to do by the time you take the corners out of a pen. Or, ewes don't sort of double up and tessellated puzzles. So when you actually measure that up as to usable space, people can find that's quite pinched at times. And it can lead to all sorts of problems, not least that if you get some ewes that can eat and some that can't, as soon as you get uneven feeding of concentrates, then you start getting acidosis, and then another lot will go in and they'll get bellyache, and the bullies will get 3 times more than anybody else. So one of the solutions is floor feeding of compounds. And this really does alleviate the limitations of feed space. There are 1 or 2 buts about this. I'm a great fan of it, but you can't just expect ewes to go from feeding in troughs to feeding on the floor. So one of the things that I do with a lot of people now is where we've got going to be floor feeding is if the replacements are on farm. So if you've got ewe lambs on farm the spring before and they're not in lamb, is to just fetch them in the shed after the ewes have gone out and get them used to the system and eating off the floor. Training at that stage, you can give them a Heptavac booster and you can get them shorn and everything else at the same time, but they do get used to the system. And it does take a little time. And also with younger ewes, shearlings, even when they have been trained a little bit, I would always bring them in that little bit earlier, spread them out so they've got plenty of space, no competition, and let them settle for a few days before you start to just tighten them up and bring any of the other ewes in. I think that's really important for them to get used to it. Once they're used to it, they are really quiet, no shouting, no pushing, everybody just gets on with it. So it reduces the speed. Obviously, they're at it for a while, and I defy anybody to go in there and find pellets later on in the day. They'll find them and they will eat them. And it evens up the intake, so the greedy bullies can't eat more than the other ewes because they simply can't get their mouths around it when it's spread around. And just reducing physical trauma. Now, those ewes you'll see are shorn, and the reason why they are shorn is that those ones are fed from a feeder which throws the pellets through the air into the pens, and we use 6 mil pellets. If we were to use them on unshorn ewes, they'd end up looking like fried tuck because they all eat each other's backs. So if you're throwing feed around in sheds and you use a unshorn, then you probably would have to use a cob, a 12 to whatever, 12, 15, 16 mil cob. But preferentially, I would use a pellet all the time because the intakes are so much more even. But it has to be a good quality, physical quality pellet. And another thing just worth thinking about in terms of troubleshooting is just organising groups. Again, these are shorn ewes, but I put this one in there just because you can see their scan mark and their raddle mark has been renewed on their bums, so they're the orange group. But just thinking about maybe body condition, so moving leaner twins up to be with triplets, trying to match things up a little bit. Litter size, of course, we've got raddle colour as we've got in the picture here. Sorry, I need to get back to that one again. And then the age of ewes. So as I said with the floor feeding, particularly with the younger ewes, you do need to perhaps just give them a little bit more time to adjust, to get used to it. And it's very interesting because when we did some of the search back on feed blocks and intakes of blocks and buckets, there's some very old data, it's not available electronically, it was very dusty, but when we found it, there was very, very clear evidence that if you put a block out and you've got mixed age groups, the older ewes will be eating the lion's share, and the younger ewes really do get put off and don't bother going in. So you really do need to bear that in mind, particularly with the self-help, which is really my next and final slide, is that, you know, where you have got self-help options, and here we've got a picture of one which is quite popular these days. I'm sure many of you will recognise what it is. The ewe there, the gaps in the bottom of the feeder, and she licks it out, and how much saliva and how much she can lick and get at limits her intakes. Again, if you've got young ewes and old ewes, you need to be really careful that you try and separate them if you can, because the old girls will keep them back. But these are not no management systems. The people who use these and are doing very well with them take a lot of time to monitor intakes and to monitor those gaps so that they know the ewes are getting what they need to. Very careful that they're pulling out ewes that aren't adapting to it and feed them normally, and also the type of feed. So, you know, little pellets and grains so that it can actually get out there. If you've got things which are different sizes and they're going to bridge, then you're not going to get the result. But some people are getting on very well with these, other people not so well, and I suspect that maybe, you know, it's the time and effort to get it right, and then it works. And by the same token, an old girl on the right there, an old mule, probably not got many teeth in her head, and there she is looking at a little bit of a molasses in a ball feeder. And again, I've got no problem with that, particularly with ewes with triplets and old girls that are going to struggle. Their molar teeth are maybe starting to give up a little bit as well. But you do just have to watch. I can see on the end of her muzzle, she's looking a little bit black. Some of them will tend to take far too much. So you just need to be a little bit careful that they're not overloading on molasses. But they do have their place. So I think that, Katie, that if we can go on to any questions and discussion now, there's probably quite a few things that have come up there that people would like to go back to or dig into.
Okay, thank you very much, Lesley. Thank you. And also, while I wait for a few questions to come in, I'd just like to remind everybody that the presentation has been recorded and will be available afterwards if you did need to recap yourself on anything that Lesley said this evening. And also, if you would like the Feeding the Ewe manual, which was updated, you could just need to have a look on the website or email BRP and we can send you a hard copy. Right, the first question, when feeding concentrates, Lesley, how much should you feed at any one time?
Okay, I mean, generally speaking, we would say no more than ½ kilo. And that would be for a decent, you know, 70 kilo plus ewe. So obviously, if they're smaller, I would shave a bit more off that. And that can be a challenge when you've got low quality forages. I would certainly, even with very low quality forages and big ewes, never go to more.
Does that mean that every time you give antibiotics, you'd need to top them up with rumen degradable protein?
No, it doesn't. I mean, undoubtedly there will be some effect depending on what the antibiotic is, but the antibiotic's been given into the bloodstream, so you know, we're not actually dosing it into the rumen. So I wouldn't have thought that there's any significant effect there. It's not like when we take antibiotics and we take pills, as it were, injecting them, generally speaking.
Okay. What do you feed? Why don't feed declarations include the energy levels?
It's a good question, and they don't, by law, they're not required to give an ME. And the answer is, I don't know. It's just convention. You know, we can tell quite a lot. One thing that you can ask for and they may or may not give it to you. And it's something called NCGD, which is neutral cellulose gamma suggestibility, but it doesn't matter what that is. But that's what we use in the lab to actually decide what the energy level is. So if you can ask somebody for that, then in the dry matter, we would be looking for that to be over 80 in a high quality compound. But they just don't have to give it. So if somebody quotes an ME to you, unless it's in writing, there is no legal obligation for them to stick to it.
Okay. Could you possibly estimate the dry matter intake of turnips for a 70 kilo ewe carrying twins in the last 6 weeks of pregnancy?
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah, I probably can do.
It's a nice one.
70 kilos times 2.5%. Yeah, well, it depends what's in front of her, but her dry matter intake, you could probably factor in that if she could get at it and she'd got the teeth for it, she'd be able to get into 1.4, 1.5 kilos of dry matter a day.
Okay, thank you. If you're floor feeding, is there an increased risk of ewes picking up gutworms?
No, there isn't. But the gutworms, the vast majority of the gutworms that are a problem to us won't be doing anything whilst they're lying there. So they might be putting eggs out, but they won't actually be hatching into infected larvae. So there isn't a problem there. When we first started doing floor feeding, which is way over 30 years ago now, there was quite a to-do about it. Certain people weren't very happy because they thought, well, there was a disease risk from doing that. But I think, you know, everybody listening now will appreciate that, you know, what ewes do when they're there during the day, they wriggle around in their bedding anyway. And actually, what we tend to do when we're floor feeding is probably keep the bedding that bit drier anyway. So no, there's no significant risk.
Okay. Another one on floor feeding. Do you need to increase the allocation to allow for spoilage or waste? No,
certainly not. If the pellet quality needs to be good. So the first test for me when I walk in a shed, if someone's doing it, the first thing I do is run my hand up the first lot of hurdles I can get anywhere near, run my finger up it. And if the pellet quality is bad and they've been feeding for a week or two, there's usually a good few millimetres of dust sat on top of the hurdles. That should never happen. So good quality pellets, no, you don't need to increase it at all.
Okay. Can you give some advice on grazing red clover?
Grazing red clover when? I don't know.
Told us that.
No, that's right. Okay. Well, red clover. I mean, obviously the danger periods are pre and post tupping from a point of view of red clover, which does have estrogenic properties, and that will upset the reproductive function at that time. In late pregnancy, depends on the quality of the silage. If I've got the choice, I wouldn't feed all red clover, but I do know at Harper, and Kate and I have discussed this several times, at Harper they've fed red clover silage, large amounts, all the way through pregnancy without any problem. So I think it just again comes back to how it's being fed and its overall quality. But there aren't any major problems with it in pregnancy. It is just around the pre and post tupping period that we'd be most concerned.
Okay. If you know your forage has trace element deficiencies, such as selenium and cobalt, what would be the best method of supplementation?
Well, if you're feeding a supplement to go with it, so if it's in a TMR, you would be putting a mineral trace element supplement with it anyway. So when you're feeding that, I would say I would put a mineral in. I would make sure that it was at the highest level of selenium, make sure the iodine's right. If you're not feeding anything with it, then certainly for selenium and iodine, a bolus would be an option. But you know, you just got to factor in that once you start feeding, you'll be supplementing anyway. So probably a trace element, or you would have it in the compound. On that though, one thing I would say to people is this year, many of you will have heard that vitamin E has been a problem because the factory that makes most of it went up in smoke in the autumn. And as a result, vitamin E has increased in price by 13 or 14 times. And whilst most compounders are, they've had to put a surcharge on, they've increased their prices, I have seen one or two instances, particularly with minerals in the last fortnight, where the amount of vitamin E has been halved and it hasn't been flagged to people. So I just encourage people just to check that the vitamin E level is what you expect it to be. I think buckets and licks and that sort of thing are probably okay, because I think most of those were probably already manufactured before this happened. But do just check your vitamin E levels.
Okay, there's another question here, but I'm not sure there's probably enough information for you to be able to answer it, Lesley. It says 8 weeks from lambing, ewes are a bit above body condition score 3, twin bearing. Would decent forage be enough? My question would be, I'm not sure what decent forage is. Have they had it analysed? So I'm not sure whether you can really answer much to that.
No, I mean, the answer would be that you'd need to have a look at an analysis. But even if it was very high quality site, so the issue with silage is that we have to be quite careful, because although it might be quite high in terms of protein, actually the energy in silage available to the bugs can very often be the limiting factor. So the analysis is everything. And the chances are that even with the best quality silage, in the last 3 weeks, you need to add a little bit, be it as soybean meal or some other protein supplement. We would usually expect to have to feed that. And we would also expect to have to feed a mineral and trace element supplement really all the way through the last 6 weeks at 20-25 grams a head a day. So maybe that helps.
Okay, thank you. What would be the best feed to increase body condition score in the last 9 weeks of lambing on good Italian ryegrass? Or would you want to increase body condition score in the last? I'm not sure.
Well, no. I mean, on good ryegrass like that, you can increase body condition score. And you can usually increase it up to about 3 or 4 weeks before lambing, but obviously there's a limit as to how much you would want that to happen. One of the issues we're starting to see now with some of the later lambing flocks that are turning, perhaps keeping ewes in, then turning them back out just before lambing to lamb, we are actually seeing some of those that getting too good, and that needs to be watched. So they can be too good, and certainly in the first 3 to 4 weeks you've got to be really careful, because the ewe will no longer put that onto herself. She'll pump it into the lambs and you'll end up with elephants. So it is a question of what does the ewe need? How much ryegrass is there? How much dry matter? And looking at what she needs and just trying to really ration it as you would ration if she was indoors being fed silage and concentrates or whatever. Just use the same approach.
That person just said they're about 2.5 body condition score now. That's why they were asking the question.
Yeah, oh, right, okay. Well, in that case, yes, the answer is yes, they could put some condition on, but you've got to be really careful. At that, they will eat more, so you need to make sure that there's plenty in front of them, and they can put a bit of condition on. But once they get to within 3 or 4 weeks of lambing, be very, very careful that you do not allow them to eat more than they need.
Okay. Could this person feed TMR type mix in a ring feeder with a feeder bucket to maximise forage efficiency? Currently feeding nuts, buckets and silage, which has a poor efficiency, and trying to sway the owner his way isn't cost effective, but it's very challenging environment at the moment with 300-year-old buildings.
Yeah.
Heard that before.
I can sympathise. Yeah, I can sympathise. Yeah, you could. But you would need to make sure, obviously, that you, as we showed in the picture, that you sort of worked out how many feeders you needed, and you could get that feed into them. I mean, the other thing as well is that a TMR is really, really good, but it has to be mixed properly. So a bad TMR is one where you can see things in, and the ewes can see it, and they start picking through it. And so you need to be very careful that the TMR was excellent. And I do wonder whether or not the cost of investing in something that would produce that TMR under those circumstances. I'd need to know the farm better, but I'd be a little bit nervous that people understand that a TMR has to be exactly that, and the ewes can't be able to pick bits out.
Okay, this person's feeding a TMR already with maize, grass and protein pellets. do you think they need an energy block as well, or could they put some mineral powder with the TMR instead?
Again, it comes back to forage quality. If we're talking good quality grass and maize and they're balanced, I'm imagining they're balancing it about 50-50, then the protein, if they're putting a protein pellet in, those are usually mineralized anyway. That should be enough on its own, but you know, I have to qualify that with the fact that I don't know what the forage analysis is.
Okay. The next question is, switching to a protein enhanced molasses seems more economical than blocks, but having had turnips this year, they're worrying about minerals.
Oh, right, okay, so they're feeding this with yeah, okay. Well, I mean, what you've got to be careful with when you start feeding turnips and so on, particularly, is iodine deficiency. So, I mean, I don't know what liquid they're feeding. I mean, it is quite a good idea that, because what's missing with turnips, once you've taken the tops off, what's missing is degradable protein. So that's quite good. But, you know, in terms of minerals, yeah, that's an issue. So whether they have to put something out free access, or if they've got specific problems, again, you could potentially use a selenium iodine bolus perhaps to get through that. But yeah, they need to take a view on it really, or at some stage you end up feeding a little bit of compound.
Okay, this next question is, they're currently feeding fodder beet to the North Country mules as well as on good quality haylage. They use a body condition score 4, 6 weeks before lambing, and they're about to start feeding some cake to the trebles and doubles. Do you think they can get away without the fodder beet?
Well, I don't know what the quality of the haylage is, so I honestly don't know. I mean, fodder beet is providing fantastic rumen energy, so fermentable energy, but it's very low on protein. So again, it comes back to how much protein is in the silage. They may well already be in a deficit. If it was my choice, I would be tempted to say I would feed the fodder beet after lambing, because on grass, because it actually does mop up the spare nitrogen in the grass and makes a really good job. But again, it's difficult to say without knowing what the analysis of the silage is.
Okay, thank you. What's the best way to get magnesium into use on spring grass?
The easy answer to that is there is no easy way. When they're on spring grass, depends whether you're feeding them or not. So if there's not enough grass and you're feeding them a compound, then that's easy. You just get the manufacturer to put the higher level of magnesium in it. So if you're feeding a 0.7% magnesium, which is higher than the highest, it's probably as high as it goes, half a kilo a day will give you their magnesium requirement. If you're not feeding, then your options are, you could bullet them. So you can give them a magnesium bullet, and they do work well. You do get the odd one cough back up, and you've got to remember they only last for about 3 weeks. After that, you're you know, susceptible again. You could put magnesium in the water, but on spring grass, question how much they actually drink. The other thing is that you can actually dust the pasture, but again, that's a bit of a, some people possibly still do it, but not many people these days, I don't think.
Okay, thanks, Lesley. And the final question this evening, what's the best way to harvest feed, forage harvester or a baler? I'm guessing they're meaning fodder beet. I
don't know, or a baler. I'm not quite sure where we're coming.
We haven't got too much information on that question.
Is that might be, is it better to make big bales or put it in a clamp? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, there's pros and cons, but for sheep, I mean, if that is the question, I mean, there's no reason why we can't make absolute top quality silage, 11.5, 12 ME silage in big bales, and we see these more, you know, now. And the real advantage of those for sheep as well is that we're then using our silage making as a grassland management tool as well. With a clamp and silage and sheep, you know, you've got to fill the clamp all at once, so you've got to set aside lots and lots of grazing, and it becomes less of lots and lots of area. It becomes less of a grazing management tool that you can use. And also sometimes with clamp silage and sheep, you know, you open the clamp and you're not going back through the clamp as fast as you would do if you're feeding the whole group of dairy cows, and it can lead to deterioration. So there's pluses and minuses, and it depends on the individual situation, but certainly there's no reason why big bale silage shouldn't be at least as good as clamp silage these days.
Okay, thank you very much, Lesley, and thanks everybody for listening this evening. We've had a great turnout and lots of great questions, so hopefully you've all got some information there to go back and analyse, check your own system, check your feed barrier space and access, and hopefully improve your new nutrition for this coming lambing season. So thank you very much. Thanks, Lesley. I hope you all have a lovely evening.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.